We've been having a lot of teachings about emptiness and dependent arising for many months now, and I guess that made this topic come up for me. I was reading just a little bit in a book by Robert Thurman, and he said something that just, I guess, for some reason, I just started laughing when I read it, and then I thought about it for the last month, and so I thought I'd share a little bit about that. And what he was saying, he was just doing an introduction to a book by Lama Tsongkhapa. And Lama Tsongkhapa had named all these Indian gods, and he was making commentary on this. And he says at one point, overwhelming and I'm putting some of this into our language because, you know, Robert Thurman, you have to translate how he says things sometimes. So for the language we're more familiar with, I'm inserting a few things. But basically, he said, overwhelming the view of the self by a penetrating transcendental wisdom, like if you have a direct realization of emptiness, there's this great sense of relief and a sense of bliss. And he actually explained how at first you kind of disoriented and this and that. And then he says, yeah, a great sense of relief, a bliss of relief from the burden of maintaining a whole world, a pleasure of transcending the Atlas pose at the core of egocentrism. So the idea is, and what made me laugh is this image of Atlas holding up the world. That's this thought that I've been working with for a long time, and why he picked that and why he used that for this idea of, you know, the self. And so first, I'll give you some background that I didn't have, because I thought Atlas was holding up the earth. But actually, Atlas was a Titan, and the Titans were conquered by the Olympian gods. And so he was actually given the task of holding up the heavens. So he has a celestial globe that's actually holding up the heavens. But in the way I used the metaphor, it was the earth, as you'll see. So basically, for eternity, he's holding up this weight of the world. And that's what Robert Thurman was tying in with this sense of the self. And so I was like, why did he pick that? You know? And so I was laughing about it, and it really struck me. So I stayed with it, and I kind of looked at this kind of more emotionally, I would say, and psychologically, and then experientially. And so what in my experience would be like that? And so the first thing that I thought about was a sense of responsibility, like you're having to hold up this earth. And I was like, but why would that be so bad, you know? And then I remembered that years ago, a psychologist had given me a book to read where it kind of came down to this thought of every virtue carried to extreme is a vice. And that's something that some people attribute to Aristotle. And so the idea was that you might have a good quality, but when you take it to excess, it kind of goes negative. And I thought that through, and I decided, you know, I actually don't really believe that. I might have thought that at the time, because that's what, you know, I was working with this person. But as I looked at that, I decided, no, in the Buddhist understanding of the mind, and when I looked at my own experience, no, the things that I do are virtuous don't convert to non-virtuous. It doesn't really go that way. You know, I think the idea we have of like maybe the mind has changed, something else has come up, and that strong light of whatever that other mental state is kind of overtakes things. And so I don't think it's like a good quality turning into a negative. And so I kind of let that go. But I still had this idea of, you know, it is really unrealistic thinking that you're going to hold up anything on your own, an earth, a project, a relationship, anything. That's clearly unrealistic. So then I decided that, well, maybe this is the controller that we talk about in the self-sufficient, substantially existent self, like this sense of the one who's in control, who can hold this thing up, hold it all together, control things. That one I stayed with for quite a long time because that seemed more maybe something that it pointed to. And I was thinking, well, how does that go? And I was thinking, you know, for eternity, he's holding this up, and then at some point his knees want to buckle. You're trying to hold everything together, and at some point it's not realistic, because things actually, that's not the reality of what's going on. The reality is much different from that. But you might feel like you're in control. You might feel like you have, you know, this project that's unfolding. That's what I was thinking about projects. Is like, you can control what's going on here. No, that's not what's happening here at all. And so then, if you think about all the kind of situations where you've done that in your life, you know, things kind of fall apart with that notion. They really fall apart, and they fall apart hard. Predictability is gone. Actually, what came to mind, because I thought he was holding the earth, what came to mind to me was like, you're like, now that you thought you were controlling everything, now you're like in the middle of a mudslide, and you're just getting carried along, right? I mean, and that is, and the other day I thought, well, that image came up to me, because that, for me, is what I would call, from my own experience, psychological overwhelm. You had an unrealistic notion, and you emotionally are thinking you're going to control this thing, and then everything's falling apart, and you're just like overwhelmed. And so, you know, I think I spent more time with Atlas, and I decided that's so unrealistic. Nothing is a solo act. The life doesn't work that way. Projects don't work that way. Relationships don't work that way. But we think that way. And so the mind gets very narrow then. And so I thought, well, you know, really everything is a dependent arising, right? So then there's this whole web of contingency. And so the image of like a big fish net came up to me, and like, you pull on one part of a net, everything else moves. Everything's interconnected. And so I was thinking then, oh, maybe that's what Indras Net is about. You know, they use this, and I talked to Karen about it, and she didn't know what it was, so I'll explain it a little bit. Indra was a god in Hinduism that was then taken into Buddhism. We recite the name chakra. That's another name for Indra in our Vinaya thing. But Indra is in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and it's the idea of like this God with a palace, and there's this big net over the palace, and every knot in the net is a jewel. So it's this magnificent jeweled net, and every gem that you look at has many facets, and it reflects every other facet. And the whole idea, according to the Princeton Dictionary, who puts everything into a very short story for you, is this idea of infinite, mutually reflecting jewels. And so it's trying to convey that everything in existence has interconnections with everything else. And I think there's some things there that maybe don't work for me, because they also talk about something with each of those knots is like a self-identity, and that kind of makes me think about all these little atlases everywhere, and I'm like, I don't think that works. But the whole idea of interconnectedness, and everything that we're doing is actually part of a big series of causes and conditions that are all coming together. And when we think about Atlas, who thinks they're in control of everything, and then things fall apart, what's so unrealistic about that is you're seeing this little narrow slice of things when things are going well, but you actually aren't seeing the big picture. And then when everything else, all the other causes and conditions come into play, I mean, you can throw yourself off a building then. People do, like when their stocks crash, you know, this is what this thinking can lead to. So that kind of unrealistic thinking usually causes a lot of problems. So Atlas represents kind of a frozen sense of self as well. And so for my mind, I think pursuing this idea of the interconnectedness of everything, it helps me to have a bigger perspective, which then I can kind of meet what's going on with a little more responsiveness rather than reactivity. I think if I'm in the mode of thinking I'm controlling everything that's going on here, and then things don't work out, then I'm kind of left backed myself into a corner psychologically, where you're kind of reactive then, where if you have a bigger picture and a more realistic view, then you can kind of see that all these things are working together. And you can, I think, psychologically be more prepared to be more responsive, knowing that, actually no one's actually in control of it all. It's all happening together and everyone's co-creating. So instead of like just kind of getting overwhelmed and checking out, you actually stay involved and you stay checked in and you do what you can do, in a situation. So I kind of stayed mostly on the side of Atlas, but I think for me, I noticed in my mind that was psychologically very beneficial. I don't think they did the metaphor this way. I don't really know that sutra, and I don't know how they use that metaphor, but I liked the idea of this seeing like this net as all these jewels as being like everyone's Buddha nature. So then wherever you looked, everyone that you saw, you'd always bring to mind their Buddha nature rather than the problems, right? And so it's a beautiful image in some way to think about the vastness of our interconnectivity with others and use these images to do that. That was my thought. It's taking our teachings where we use reasonings and using images to work with them, which somehow works for me sometimes.